Under the glow of a quiet Oklahoma dawn, a teenage boy stood at the center of a storm that no one saw coming. His name, Jesse Butler. To many, he was the pride of Stillwater, a bright student, a promising athlete, the kind of young man teachers praised and parents wanted their sons to be like. But in the shadows of his small-town fame, a story was forming. One that would challenge everything we thought we knew about justice, privilege, and the power of silence. What if the system we trust most, the one that's supposed to protect the innocent, was never built to protect everyone equally? What if the safety of your daughter depended not on the law, but on who the offender's father happened to be? This is the story that shook an entire town, a case that made even seasoned investigators question where the line between justice and influence truly lies. Jesse Butler, 18 years old, son of a prominent Oklahoma family, charged with crimes so disturbing that prosecutors said they carried a potential 78-year sentence: rape, strangulation, sexual assault, multiple victims. Evidence that left little room for doubt. Yet against all odds, he walked free. No prison, no bars, just community service, counseling, and probation. The question the nation is asking: how does someone plead guilty to crimes like that and still go home? To understand that, you need to look beyond the headlines. You need to see what happens when power, perception, and privilege intersect. Jesse wasn't just any student. His father, known in the community for his work around college athletics, was well connected. The Butler family name carried weight, a name that opened doors, that drew sympathy even when facts painted a different picture. The first reports came from two young women who decided to speak up. Their accounts, detailed and consistent, painted a horrifying scene. They described being attacked, strangled, unable to breathe. One said, "If it had lasted a few seconds longer, I might not be here." Imagine being a teenage girl forced to relive that trauma in court, while the person responsible sat in the same room with barely a sign of remorse. The local police investigated. The evidence was clear. But then came the turning point, the plea deal. The charges were real, but the outcome felt unreal. Prosecutors agreed to a plea arrangement under Oklahoma's youthful offender law, and the judge accepted it. Jesse Butler, facing nearly 80 years in prison, was given probation until his 19th birthday. No jail, no conviction on his record if he completes his program successfully. The public's reaction was instant outrage. People filled the courthouse steps with signs that read, "Justice denied" and "Victims deserve more." They weren't just angry at one boy. They were angry at a system that seems to work differently depending on your last name. Why would a judge allow that? Why would a prosecutor accept it? Why do we keep pretending these are isolated mistakes instead of repeated patterns? When wealthy or well-connected families stand before the court, the outcomes are often softer. The language changes from predator to troubled youth, from crime to mistake. Society loves redemption stories, but whose redemption are we prioritizing? The victims who still wake up at night haunted by what happened, or the young man whose privilege makes him too valuable to punish? Jesse's story is not new. It echoes cases across America. Affluent teenagers walking free after devastating crimes. Judges citing their bright futures as reasons to avoid prison. But what about the bright futures of the girls whose lives will never be the same? One of them told reporters, "He took away my sense of safety. Every day feels like survival." Her words barely made it to the evening news, buried under headlines about a controversial sentencing. The public outrage didn't fade. It grew. As footage spread online, Jesse Butler became a name synonymous with broken justice. Yet, some in the town defended him. They said he was young, that he deserved another chance, that boys make mistakes. But when does a mistake become a pattern? When does accountability matter more than reputation? And if it had been your daughter, would you still call it a mistake?
What's more disturbing is how the entire case was handled behind closed doors. No public trial, no full cross-examination, no cameras in the courtroom. For a case of this magnitude, it felt too quiet, too contained, almost protected. It's easy to wonder, was the quiet intentional? Did anyone want to make sure this didn't go national? Because the facts, when laid bare, are impossible to ignore. 2 victims, physical evidence, medical reports, a clear pattern of violence, yet somehow a suspended sentence. The official justification was rehabilitation. He's still young enough to change, they said. But why do we assume change only matters when the offender looks a certain way or comes from a certain family? Would a black teenager from the east side of town, charged with the same crimes, walk out with a community service order? Would his story be called a learning opportunity, or would it be labeled a violent threat? That's not just a question, it's a mirror reflecting who we are as a society. The victims and their families were left devastated. One of the mothers said, "I watched my daughter go through the hardest moment of her life, and then I watched the system tell her that it didn't matter." The trauma didn't end when the case closed. In fact, for them, it had just begun. Every time they hear Jesse Butler's name, it's a reminder that justice can be selective. Now the case is sparking nationwide debate. Activists are demanding reforms to how youthful offender laws are applied. Legal experts are questioning the role of influence in sentencing decisions. And regular people, viewers like you, are starting to ask, how often does this really happen? How many other Jesse Butlers are out there shielded by privilege, walking free while victims struggle to rebuild their lives? You have to ask yourself, how does a judge sleep at night after making a decision like that? What message does it send to young men across the country? That if you come from the right family, consequences don't apply? Or that accountability is optional for the privileged? It's a dangerous precedent, one that chips away at the public's faith in justice, one case at a time. Stillwater, once known for its peaceful charm, has become a symbol of something darker. A reminder that behind every quiet town are stories people would rather ignore. The protests outside the courthouse weren't just about one verdict. They were about decades of frustration. People are tired of watching money and connections bend the rules. They're tired of seeing victims blamed while offenders are protected. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not just one young man's actions, but the society that allows them to go unpunished. The teachers who ignored warning signs, the classmates who stayed silent, the officials who turned compassion into an excuse, the power structure that shields the privileged. Every one of them played a part. What happens now? Jesse Butler remains on probation until he turns 19. If he completes his program, his record will be wiped clean, erased, as if nothing ever happened. Meanwhile, his victims are left with memories they can't erase, pain they didn't choose, and a system that told them to move on. This isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. There are still questions that haven't been answered. Who influenced the plea deal? Were there discussions behind closed doors that shaped this outcome? And most importantly, how many more cases like this are being silenced before they ever reach the headlines?
But just when the outrage seemed to fade, new information began to surface. Information that raised even more questions about how deep this story really goes. A former classmate came forward, anonymously, claiming that Jesse had been protected for years. According to her, this wasn't the first time troubling behavior had been quietly handled within the school. She described how teachers would redirect disciplinary reports, how certain complaints never made it to the principal's office, and how rumors about incidents at parties were brushed off as gossip. The message was clear. Some names were too important to touch. Local reporters began tracing those rumors. They found that a year earlier, another student had allegedly filed a written complaint about unwanted advances, but no formal action was taken. The document, buried in a confidential school file, only resurfaced after the current case gained attention. The same pattern appeared: silence, redirection, and the quiet protection of a young man whose family held influence. It wasn't just a failure of law, it was a failure of culture, the kind that starts long before a courtroom ever gets involved. One teacher, now retired, said off camera, "We were told to handle things internally. The goal was always to avoid negative press." Imagine hearing that, realizing that the safety of students was traded for the illusion of a perfect reputation. How many warnings does a system need before it finally acts? How many voices must be ignored before a tragedy becomes inevitable? Then there's the judge. Court records show that during sentencing, he described Jesse as capable of great reform. He spoke about his potential, his youth, his future. But in all those words, one thing was missing: acknowledgement of the girls whose futures were already shattered. Legal analysts later discovered that the judge had previously served on a community board with one of Butler's family friends. No evidence of direct bias, but the optics were impossible to ignore. When justice is handled by people who know each other, how impartial can it really be? Even within law enforcement, unease began to grow. A source close to the investigation admitted that officers were shocked when this sentencing came down. "We expected prison time. We gathered the evidence. We did everything by the book. But once it hit the courtroom, it wasn't our call anymore." His words reveal something painful, that even those who try to uphold the law can feel powerless when the system starts bending around influence. And then came the photos. Images circulating among classmates showed Jesse attending a local event just weeks after sentencing, smiling, socializing, taking pictures with friends. To the victims, those images were a gut punch. They watched as the person who changed their lives walked freely, publicly, while they struggled to find peace in private. One of them reportedly said, "He's living like nothing happened," and maybe, to him, nothing did. That single sentence carries the weight of everything that's wrong with this story. But the cracks are widening. Activists are demanding an independent review of how the plea deal was reached. Legal watchdogs are calling for transparency in the youthful offender process, asking why such cases are sealed so easily. Meanwhile, whispers are spreading that more victims might exist, people who stayed silent out of fear or futility. If true, it means this case isn't an exception, it's a pattern waiting to be exposed. Every few years, we're reminded of how fragile justice can be, how easily empathy shifts to the one who looks more familiar, more promising, more like someone worth saving. It's a pattern as old as the system itself. Privilege wrapped in compassion, accountability traded for comfort. And when that happens, victims stop coming forward. They stop believing their voices matter. And that's how silence becomes culture. Stillwater's quiet streets are different now. The community feels divided between those who want to move on and those who refuse to forget. Some parents have pulled their daughters out of local schools. Others are demanding new safety protocols and transparency policies. A movement is forming online, led by young women who grew up in that same town, determined to make sure no one else is ignored the way these victims were. It's unsettling to think about how many other towns carry stories like this, hidden, buried, waiting for someone brave enough to tell them. Stories that could have been prevented if people had listened the first time, if adults had acted instead of protected, if the law had remembered who it's supposed to serve. Stay tuned to Undercover Truth, because the next chapter of this case reveals something even more alarming: internal emails quietly leaked that may expose who knew what and when. What's written in those messages could change everything we thought we understood about this case and about justice itself. You won't want to miss what comes next.